Welcome to Journeys in Podcasting, a Friday afternoon edition. So everyone who's here is here because they really want to be. I'm Chris here in Bogota, Colombia. This is a sabbatical year for me, and today we're really lucky to get to talk to Brian Mayer, who is a game designer, librarian, author. Brian, can you introduce yourself and maybe just give us a little bit of background?
Sure. Hi, I'm Brian Mayer. I am a gaming and library technology specialist out of Western New York. So I support like 22 school districts. Part of what I do in that support is use games and game design to support curriculum in the classroom, pushing in, working with classroom teachers and school librarians to use game resources. Also a game designer, Design Freedom the Underground Railroad, and also working now in the space of using escape rooms as a further way to explore ways to kind of engage students with content and with learning.
Great. Brian, you're kind of all over the place, and I know I originally approached you to talk about escape rooms, but when I realized like your vast area of knowledge, I'd like to ask you a question just about librarian space or library space itself.
Sure.
And why that's so important in any kind of current mind shift happening in education today. I live in Colombia, where I would say that I pass my fellow Homo Ludens on a day-to-day basis. We recently hosted a podcast with Lisa Westman, who talked about teaching as being this really hard thing that people had to do. You mentioned in your book this puritanical approach to learning, that when it comes to how we define, acquire, demonstrate knowledge, we're so caught up in being Homo sapiens, like humans who know, that we remove ourselves from our Homo faber, humans as makers, or Homo ludens, humans as players. How does a library space become a space where we can kind of encompass all three of these things?
Well, libraries are this fantastic space that allow for connection across curriculum and focus on really the ability to explore, for students to kind of go down this path of inquiry and kind of follow their interests and their direction and naturally kind of learn and grow. We're a place that supports resources, whatever they may be. So, traditional libraries are books, but libraries are in this really cool space of really a renaissance in terms of who we are and what we do and how we provide services and what that looks like. And so, we're now looking at ways to engage people in exploring and growing concepts and curriculum and who they are through physical resources, digital resources, what we kind of interact and engage with. You've got public libraries doing seed libraries and lending those things. You've got the growth of maker spaces and 3D design and exploring what learning and understanding is through putting things together and connecting things. And so games kind of fit in there really well because they are the space that is safe to explore concepts and ideas, to try and to fail, and to come up with new strategies and approaches. And so it kind of, straddles that fence between, traditional curriculum concepts of learning and growth and kind of the exploratory, kind of student-driven inquiry perspectives of, information literacy and library spaces.
So I see in teaching this modularity to everything that reading time we read, writing time we write, and you mentioned several times in your book as well that quote, games are seen as the reward for finishing required work and never part of the actual work. And I see the same problem in our arts integration or even in our when we do media. I feel like we lose the leveraging of doing things like video projects. It's the thing they do after they finish the writing, whereas if they move back and forth in those spaces or wrote while they were creating the video, then you're really playing with the modalities of perception. Then you're really like working off of different strengths. When you're designing game space in the libraries, is this something you try to push and think about to integrate the different disciplines and integrate the different ways that kids can create?
Yeah, no, I mean absolutely. That's part of the challenge of, whether you're bringing in games as a resource to use to connect and engage kids with curriculum, or if you're, using it as a resource for the students to be makers and creators and use it as a tool to demonstrate what they know and understand is at the end of the day, classroom teachers have a set amount of time and a set understanding of like, what they can do and a comfort level. And the goal is to show them and demonstrate how this as a resource and as a tool directly connects to what they need to do as a classroom teacher. There's a lot of, at least here in the States, there's a lot of pressure on teachers to kind of meet certain target goals, to address particular curriculum, and there's accountability for kind of what's happening in the classroom. And so the challenges and the struggles are oftentimes, that sounds really neat and great, but at the end of the day, I need to do X, Y, and Z. So, our approach has always been, well, this is an educational resource. This is a tool that you can use that directly connects and addresses curriculum. And so then that starts a conversation and kind of opens some doors if you're speaking kind of the language of the teachers and the needs and the desires of what they have to hit and what they want to accomplish. And then you extend that with conversations about how this connects with students in a way that perhaps traditional classroom measures don't always do. A lot of the great things that we see from using games and game design is that kids that oftentimes don't connect with more traditional approaches connect here with this type of resource for a number of different reasons, whether there's an authenticity to it that they connect with or a familiarity from their own personal lives that draws them out and brings them in a way. And especially with the design stuff is really funny because you'll have kids that are good students that know how to be a good student and know kind of the traditional ways of what you need to do to be a good kid, and then you put them in this kind of space where they have to be game creators. And suddenly they struggle because that doesn't fit the mold or the expectation of what they're used to. But then you have these other kids that normally don't do well in a kind of a more structured school environment and a structured kind of curricular setup of doing the paper and the worksheets and all of that, and suddenly they blossom and shine and almost take on a role of leadership kind of in that project and in that space because they have a comfort level to kind of think a little more laterally and outside of the box as opposed to your more like very comfortable structured kids that are good with curriculum, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking like, how do you? I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here because they're kind of stacking up in my mind. Well, one is like, how do you document these larger outcomes of learning, and what do you use as kind of guideposts? For example, I've been looking a lot at new literacies, and as I'm reading you, I'm looking straight over at this list and just kind of checking off, like play, the capacity to experiment with one's surroundings as a form of problem solving. Performance, the ability to adopt alternative identities for the purpose of improvisation and discovery, and it just goes down the list. Simulation, distributed cognition, collective intelligence, all of these things come into play in a lot of the games that you're talking about. Are you conscious of that? Do you have a model that you work with? How do you create that experience, and then how do you document and reflect on it?
So I usually work as a partner with the classroom teacher, and so kind of in preparation with that, we kind of build and develop rubrics in terms of how we would like to see learning outcomes kind of manifest themselves at the end of kind of the game experience if we're running games, or the game design project at the end of it. And so oftentimes it's that exploration and application of the content during the course of play that we see the students being able to kind of understand concepts and take them from the classroom and translate them to kind of the play experience and use them to kind of explore and move themselves forward in gameplay. Sometimes it comes through kind of self-reflective pieces at the end where the students then reflect upon, their understanding, how that understanding connected to the kind of the play experience in the games that they were doing or the designs that they were doing. And in design, too, that's a whole separate area where you can see that through kind of the process and growth of the game design and their ability to kind of go back and do some iterative changes and integrate kind of the concepts that's happening in the classroom. So there's not like a single answer. It depends on kind of what we're doing, who we're collaborating with, and the kind of the style of the project that we're doing.
I see Joe talking, so I left a dramatic pause. Joe, can you turn your mic on? Oh, Joe, I can't hear you. So if you want to type whatever you're saying or put it in the document, then we'll throw it in there. Or play with your mic settings and see if we can get your mic on too. In the meantime, I'm gonna keep pushing forward. I'm looking at our time, so I mean I have a ton of questions, but I want to kind of push towards a couple of the things that we asked you to talk about. And one was this new, I call it new because it's very new to me, the idea of the breakout room or the escape room, which now I realize there's entire Twitter networks for teachers that just talk about the design of these spaces. So it's a really cool new discovery for some of us. This is to me, it seems like it's such the perfect module on its own that, to immerse into a subject or topic of study, but also could be a module like within a project or even be a series of rooms where you could tie them together. How have you designed these? How have you used them? And maybe even explain to if anyone's listening that doesn't know what an escape room is, maybe you could explain what an escape room is and why this works so effectively to get kids to hype up their problem solving and their collaboration skills.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So escape rooms, like the traditional concept is that you are in a room and you have to get out of that room. More often than not, there's kind of some thematic context of why you're in the room. So great example, one I did this summer, kind of the setup was that there was this art dealer, and the art dealer secretly kind of dealt in stolen paintings, and he had a meeting and we had an hour to get into his back office and find the stolen painting and make our way out. So we started in a front gallery and we got into his back office, and then when we were in the back office we found this hidden room with this bookcase that slid across, and we got into the back room and then we found the stolen painting and we were able to get out in that time frame. And there's all sorts of puzzles and obstacles and different things that you have to kind of connect and put together, and oftentimes not in a very kind of linear sort of way. So it's a much more open, free space for exploration where you have to find different pieces, and it's up to you in terms of how you're progressing, though kind of underneath the kind of drapery, there is definitely a logical sequence of things that need to happen for that escape to happen. So there's this opportunity to take narrative and kind of immerse and draw students in a way that becomes much more real and meaningful, because it doesn't just happen in front of a computer or on a table. It kind of immerses you in your whole environment, and you become drawn in and engaged. So what we did was, from our concept or our perspective, we service 22 school districts, and a lot of our resources we share out with them. And so kind of our approach was, well, how do we take this concept, this idea of student, kind of inquiry and exploration, working together as a group and problem solving, kind of finding information, sharing that information with each other, and taking that and finding ways to kind of reimagine it and reconnect it to kind of solve problems and move forward. And how do we kind of make that work in an educational space and in a way that can be pushed out and shared? And we've been doing a lot of work with Minecraft as well too, in education, and kind of creating these Minecraft worlds for students to explore curriculum and concepts. And that kind of made this beautiful marriage where we could say, okay, what if we took the room, and rather than having to worry about the constraints of the physical environment and oftentimes not knowing, what the library or the classroom is going to look like, but we could craft and build a world in Minecraft, which gives us the freedom and the flexibility and the vast space. You can do some amazing things in that digital space. And we can leverage mods to do like securities and locks. There's so much that we could do to be cost efficient in Minecraft. And then we can build that world, put it on a USB drive, and then send out a tub full of physical puzzles as well too, all preset, to say, here's your world, here's the curriculum that it supports, here are the puzzles, so you can load it up fire it up, get the kids to sit down, and have them start playing. But that physical aspect was important as well too, because there's so much things that come from like being in a room and working together as a group, collectively, to kind of work through problems and move forward. And so what we wound up doing was, in a lot of the rooms you start in a digital space. We've built the room in Minecraft, and you start exploring, and the kids find a box, and then we bring this physical box out, and we put it on the table, and kids are like, oh. And they get up, and some of the kids get up and start exploring that box, and then they find some things that then feed back into the digital space, and so you get this beautiful kind of organic conversation that happens between the digital and the physical space, as like kids are working on puzzles in the digital Minecraft world, and they come across something like a code or some sort of clue that is useful to the kids that are working in the physical space, and vice versa. And they're having conversations across that space. They're not texting or typing. They're kind of talking. And even the kids that are working in Minecraft are not typing at each other. They're like talking, Bob, come on over in the room over here, because I'm stuck on this thing. Oh, I found that thing. I know what you need. And they're working together across kind of the divide, and within the divide, and it's really beautiful. And so that was our starting space, and then we're exploring, can we do just physical things that can easily be shared out and expressed. But I think there's a lot of value too in terms of just creating that conversation within and across digital and physical as well too.
Preparing them for a future of augmented and virtual reality where that's going to be part of their normal existence anyway.
Yeah.
That sounds absolutely amazing. And as I'm listening to you, you use the word tool a lot, and I was wondering if that comes from any Vygotsky activity theory background, in that the introduction of a new tool into environment is a new tool for cognition and a new tool for collaboration, a new way of getting people to communicate and work together. Because that sounds exactly what you're working through there.
A little bit, yeah, absolutely. I see Joe's got some questions. Do we want to?
Yeah, Joe has, and it's very pertinent to what you were just talking about. He's asking about, I don't know if you can see the question, but I'm going to read it out loud. He's got two parts. One is the branding and the clarification between gamification and game-based learning, because you're sort of walking back and forth between the two, I think. And how can this understand the distinction, help explain some of the concepts you're talking about? And the second one, he talks about Joey Lee at Columbia Teachers College talks about gamifying the learning environment versus gamifying the content. And how do you see the distinction working in learning environments? Should we leverage the students to create escape rooms instead of the teachers? So he's got like 4 questions in there.
There are. Gamification versus kind of using game elements to kind of engage with the content. At least for me, my approach with it is, oftentimes gamification is using some of the elements that have some short-term engagement for people participating. So you think about summer reading programs with points, and you get your stars and you fill up your thing. But how much is that impacting kind of the longer-term goals of what's going on? Versus taking, and that's like a layer that's put on top. Versus taking game elements and making them an inseparable and integral part of how you interact with and engage with curriculum and content. And I think there's more value in the latter part, because then you are exploring in a playful and engaging way curricular concepts and skills that draw on much more of the intrinsic motivation and create this kind of safe space of play that, kind of when we play, there's a safe space that's created that we can try and explore and fail and come up with new strategies. And I think there's so much more value to that than necessarily kind of doing a layer of some of the gamification things of points and badges and leveling up. Not that there's necessarily anything, it's the outcome of what you're trying to do and how fully engaged across the length of your project and your scope that kind of what you're trying to do. I don't do much gamification, so I can't speak too deeply to that. Just from my experience of working with kids in the classroom and using games to engage them, kind of that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I saw that somewhere in your readings too about this idea that games are best used when they're drawing upon the intrinsic motivation of kids.
Right.
The more of these extrinsic motivators don't have direct ties to the content, the more we're messing with their intrinsic motivation ability as well. I had a question for you because we just spoke with Toby Emmert about participatory theater, theater of the oppressed, where very similar to game space, they set up this safe place of play where they'll take narrative, freeze it, pick it apart, act it out in different ways. A lot of the things that you're describing in game space as well. Do you ever set up games? And I'm kind of comparing this to like a Paul Darvasi project where every game he plays in the classroom is very different because it's very much a participatory event. It depends on those actors that are there in the space. That it's very difficult to reproduce it, like to take that game, write it up, and reproduce it with another teacher in another school somewhere, where a lot of board games can just simply be reproduced, mass-marketed. Have you ever designed games that are more dependent on this particular subjective space that may not ever be played out the same way two times?
No, I don't. Simply, in terms of what we do is we want something that is replicable and shareable with other people, and your experiences are going to vary still depending on the choices and the interactions of the students and kind of what they're doing through gameplay. And good games offer a lot of open space for exploration and a lot of variables and multiple paths towards what could be considered victory or winning the game and coming away with an understanding. The cool thing about, like I said, I mentioned before, we strictly use more of like the physical board games in that, and the, kind of one of the reasons and approaches is that there's, going back to the concept of the tool, is that, those can be set up and adjusted and modified for use in the classroom. So you can create intentional instructional moments by stacking the deck or adjusting things slightly so that you get a specific desired outcome for conversation or reflection, or setting something up so a certain set of skills have to be used kind of in the exploration and the play of that game. So, I mean, there's some flexibility in terms of creating unique environments by adjusting kind of the bits and kind of what's happening in play while still, striving to maintain the authenticity and the engagement of the play experience, which is where a lot of the value lies.
I'm watching time. Can we go a couple more questions, or
Sure.
Because I know you have kids waiting in some corner.
No, that's okay.
Okay, so feel free to cut us off at any time because we're going to squeeze you for all it's worth. You're an award-winning game designer for your work with Underground.
Freedom, the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, and so I was listening to another interview with you. You talk a lot about how the game began with narrative, and when you design a game, it starts with narrative. And this is one of the things that they say if you're going to do gamification in the classroom, for example. One of the first steps is don't kill yourself trying to create the narrative. Appropriate one, borrow one. Like we did something with fourth graders turning into insects. So we took the movie The Fly, and had kids processing their content through the perspective of this person who's changing into an insect. Can you explain a little bit how that works? Like, where do you get the narrative, and then how do you transform narrative into a dynamic game that's going to get all these, working nodes working together?
That's a really great question, and with I suppose a lot of complex answers. I mean, game designers come from different places. So some game designers come from a space of mechanisms, and they have a really refined way that you play a game and the way that the system works, and then they look for a narrative to kind of unfold, and kind of put it on top of that. And other people start from a narrative perspective, which is kind of where I come from. I have this story or this concept that I want to explore and tell, and then how do I translate that across? How do I find mechanisms or the ways of interacting that support that, that narrative concept and that idea. So, to be quite honest, either approach can work depending on who you are as a designer and what you're trying to accomplish. I had a friend who was a physics teacher who came up to me and said, hey, I'm working on quarks, and it's really kind of not my kids aren't connecting with it. Can you come up with a game about quarks? And I was like, I don't know anything about quarks. And then I explored quarks, and they're incredibly fascinating and cool. And I looked at kind of the science of quarks and how they work and all the uniqueness and the things that happen. And then I found a way to say, all right, how can I translate that and replicate that through gameplay and through a way that's reflective of, in the best way possible, what happens with kind of quarks in science and how they interact in nature and how they come together and explode and combine and break down and all of those things in a way that kind of translates into a card game. And part of, how do you make that happen comes from a familiarity with the medium. And, if you're going to write a kids YA book, you're going to read a lot of kids YA books, just to kind of get familiar with kind of the tools of the trade and some of the ways that people are doing things that kids connect with, some of the kind of the standards. And same thing with game design. You've learned the tools and the mechanisms and the different things, and you have that as a back catalog, so that as you're saying, all right, how do I tell this narrative of the abolitionist movement and the struggle and the challenges that kind of are there, and how do I translate that into something that draws people in and engages them? And in my case, my goal was to try and create something that transcends beyond cards and bits and draws you in a way that makes what's happening a little bit more meaningful. And that's one of the great things about game and play is that it draws you in. You have an emotional connection to what's happening. We become invested in the process and in the experience, and so that's part of the power and the amazement of games and play. And if you can do that and connect it to curriculum in a way that there's things that the kids are studying and exploring, and you can make it emotionally an emotional investment on the part of the students to draw them in and care about what's happening, or see a reason for why that is that they're doing what they're doing. It's incredibly powerful. So it's a challenge, and there's no straight line because many different people take different perspectives on and approaches in terms of how they make that happen. For me, it was to start with a goal of wanting to tell the struggle in the narrative in as sensitive a way as I could of kind of the abolitionist movement. And I saw the power of like historical card-driven games. So there's a number of great kind of historical games that are card-driven, like 1960, The Making of the President, and there's a whole coin series of games where they kind of draw in the people and the events and use them as kind of a catalyst for kind of exploring and playing and moving the game forward. So there was like that space where I started from, and then I saw this wonderful woman talk, Brenda Romero, who does a lot of like art installation style games. She created a game about the Middle Passage, and she created the game about the Trail of Tears and Irish and over in Ireland with the slavery from England and all of that. And hers are these and the Holocaust as well too. She was speaking about the game Train that she created for the Holocaust, and kind of where that came from and how games can be more than fun and can be more than what we traditionally perceive of them as. That they can be dramas, that they can be moving, that they can be meaningful. And it's very equatable, like in terms of library spaces, with like graphic novels. I don't know if you're familiar with graphic novels. I think most of us are. But, like 15, 20 years ago, they really kind of started bubbling up, and a lot of people are like, oh, that's comics, that's for kids, right? That's kind of light literature. That's not really, something deep and meaningful, and games are kind of in that similar space where they are exploring some of those really rich, robust, deep concepts. And so that was my approach, was taking that kind of understanding that games can be more, they can be kind of these dramatic, engaging, emotional things, and then drawing on the desire to kind of engage students with an important time in history and dealing with it in a way that is sensitive to the topic, but also engages them in a way that's much more deeper than kind of what the curriculum traditionally allows.
I'm going to keep pushing if you can keep going. There's a couple of questions left. Lola has one, and there's two up there, questions up there. Lola has one that's very pertinent to what you're talking about right now. I recently have been experimenting with this game, Eve Online, and I'm not a big online gamer, but Eve is like so incredibly deep. It's actually like rehearsal for economics and group organization in the real world. More than the real world is sometimes. She wants to know about your current experience. Are you strictly analog games? How do you feel? You mentioned Minecraft, the sandbox games. Mm-hmm. What is your feeling about the analog versus the digital games?
So in terms of analog games, what I like about them is the ability to take it as a system or as a tool, use it as is, modify, manipulate, adjust. If you have a video game, it is generally, unless you have a good amount of coding experience or it's like this open modding sandbox thing, it is what it is. And if the designer, the people that created it, did it well enough, then it's going to work good. And if it doesn't, you can't do much with it. Additionally, there's the constraints of technology and all of that. And it's not that digital games, there's not value there. There definitely is. But there's so much more openness and flexibility and a lot of kind of good games that relate to and support curriculum. And so, the challenge, especially with video games, is kids are gamers. They play games. And they have an expectation for what their play experience in game is going to be. And more often than not, you put like a video game that has educational aspirations in front of them, it oftentimes fails in terms of the authenticity or the strength of the gameplay, because many times it's created by people with a pedagogical curricular goal in mind, and the game design is often an afterthought or is not their area of strength. A lot of what we do is look at, modern style games, and our selection criteria goes like this. I look for really good games, and then I say, do these support curriculum? And I look through the curriculum to see, can they support it? I look at the time that it takes to introduce and invest it, and then look for the return on investment and say, okay, is it worth spending the time to set it up and play and guide through? And so I have that flexibility to kind of modify and adjust, so I can take a game for 6 players and I can tweak it so that I can run it with a whole class. And I just get a bit more flexibilities, which is why I go with board games versus video games. And what's interesting is a lot of times we bring these into the classroom and the kids, and this is slightly shifting as these games become more and more prevalent and kind of in society and in stores and people get exposed to them. But it's still, a lot of kids don't know these resources. And so initially it's the eye roll and the, oh, we're going to play an educational game. It's going to be a worksheet and a spinner. But that's not, and then they start to play and they go, oh, wait a minute, this is actually good. And then they start getting invested and they're like, and the best moment is this. When the class is done and they say, where can I get this? And then if I've picked a good resource that was supporting something that I intentionally wanted to happen, and then they're going out and independently choosing to engage with and continue that, how powerful is that? Because you know what, a lot of those kind of educational video games, I don't know how many kids past like 3rd or 4th grade, when they get bigger, are going back and being like, yes, I'm playing Math Blaster! So at least for us, that's the kind of the approach and the value is, you can do a lot more with board games, and as video games continue to grow, and there's some really great stuff out there. Don't get me wrong, I'm not bashing video games. I mean, there's some really great engaging things that are happening. There's just a bit more flexibility in the short run for kind of doing that, and that's at least why we approach board games.
What about, you're talking about like how this goes deep into the curriculum, how it's going to leverage them going deeper into their standards, their objectives and everything. I'm framing my question. Just give me a moment. Okay, so anytime you create a simulation, you're creating a simplification of some very complex things. You're taking something incredibly complex, you're putting it into a model that kids can grapple with and that the rest of us can deal with. Mm-hmm. And yet, that's not the the end goal. The end goal is to get them to then go much deeper into their study and realize the complexity of the system or whatever they're studying. Do you have mechanisms for releasing them back out of the complexity of things? Like, how do you go beyond the game, I guess is what I'm asking.
That's a good question. And again, it's funny that, I mean, there is no like set answer model. It oftentimes depends on the class and what's happening, but oftentimes if it's from gameplay, then it's taking that gameplay that the students have done and then causing them to use that as a starting point for inquiry. So then, okay, we played this game. All right, what was interesting, or what was challenging, or what did you find during the course of play that sparked some questions, and start to explore those questions so that you get kind of student-driven inquiry coming from kind of the gameplay itself. If it's talking about doing game design, then you can do some interesting things as well there too. You talked a little bit about different approaches to doing games, and so we do I do different levels of game design when I do this with kids. So first step is, here's a game that's really broken. How do you fix it? Step 2, here's a game that works. Let's kind of redesign it or use it as a launching point to kind of explore and make our own game, so that I don't have to worry about the problems and challenges of coming up with a well-balanced game. I could take a well-balanced game and do something with it. So a great example is, there's a game like Power Grid, which is about running your own power companies and building power plants of different types of resources, and having a market for where those resources come from in a geographical location. And then so students can then say, all right, well, here's the Power Grid game for the United States. Well, let's create a map for Korea, and what would that look like? Let's do the research on like the energy choices and the availability of resources in Korea, and let's use that as kind of a launching point to do that. And then there's original game design, which is this whole other animal of taking and growing and doing iteration and applying and developing and figuring out a way to take and create a model or a system that is representative or reflective of something in the real world.
Awesome. We needed to talk to you this time last year before we had kids designing games, and we kind of learned the hard way. We actually went through the same steps that you just talked about. In the beginning, we just said, go make a game, and we saw this massive confusion. So we started studying other games, and then we started, okay, what can we adopt from this game and take from this game? And then we kind of put certain parameters around it and let them play within that box. And some of the results were absolutely amazing. When kids really it really made them process this content at a whole new level.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I know we're way over time, but Alex wants to exit with he had a really good question about, so you want to get into escape rooms. How do you get started? Like a very simple steps. Do you call your friends over, throw them in a room, lock the door, and say they can't get out till they solve the puzzle? Or do you, for anyone ready to jump into this, how would you suggest they do it?
Awesome question. There's a few different ways you can get into it. So the best way is go to an escape room if you can, but not everyone has a facility around them. Next step, there are actually starting to come out with kind of escape rooms in a box. For example, Think Fun just came out with the game Escape the Room, Stargazer's Manor. Spin Master just created kind of the escape room game, which has 4 different little escape room puzzles. Now, it's not like the large, environmental experience that an escape room is, but it takes some of those kind of puzzle, group problem solving, exploration, working together elements, and brings it to the table where people kind of work through some of those things. And that's a good kind of first step. After that, another avenue for kind of exploring is, and I think you talked a little bit about it earlier, was Breakout EDU is kind of this new space that has come out. So there's this company that says, hey, we're going to kind of come up with a simple set of resources that you can use, and teachers and educators are going to kind of use that as a toolkit to create their own escape rooms. So you've got educators that are thinking about curriculum and creating escape room experiences to be used in the classroom. And so you can go there, and they'll either, you can like get from them, it's like $99 or something, and you get the kit, or they say, here's the shopping list that you can get it from Amazon with the links to all the things, so that you can go and just pick up those things yourself and have them. And it's just, you know, a simple box and different locks and different sorts of invisible inks things and stuff like that, but it's this kind of set of resources that then you can go. You don't have to make them yourselves. You can go on and say, all right, Breakout EDU, can you show me, let me see all the different rooms that were created. You can explore and find one that fits, and then use the tools or resources you've collected to kind of set it up and run it. And then you do a few of those, and then, you know, kind of like what I talked about with games, and, you know, you play games to learn the medium, then you start to explore and say, oh, I see how different people are doing it. Now let me tweak and adjust it for kind of what I'm doing in my classroom with my students and with my kind of curricular needs. And then you start doing it yourself, and you wind up buying like weird cryptexes and all sorts of like other weird things as well too, and you get all excited and go down this rabbit hole.
You mentioned resource. You are an amazing resource, and you offer a ton open source. Can you just break it down? How can people find you, your games, your resources for librarians, where you blog, write, publish?
Sure. So our game library, if you're interested in seeing all the games that we actually have, is gvlibraries.org/gaming, and there's like a drop down there that you can browse our game library by like age level and content, curricular standards, and I've done a lot of alignment work. So if you want to explore stuff that works, that's a good place to go. I will say that you know, some of the resources that we have support kids with different needs, like fine and gross motor skills and things like that. I work with a lot of special ed populations as well too, and we have a lot of kind of just game groups as well too that we have some resources for them as well. So that's a great place just to see kind of, you know, 10 years worth of playing and vetting and exploring, and it's a nice collection of resources there. My game, you can find it anywhere. I mean, Amazon or, you know, your friendly online game store. It's just out there. And then there's actually, if you are interested and not overly familiar with board games, Board Game Geek is really the repository and the home of everything and anything gaming, from, you know, Mystery Date all the way up to all the games that are coming out today. And the Quantum Physics Quark game is actually up there as a print and play, so you can grab the files from there. It's Quark is the name of the game. And so that'll be listed for me there. And then I write for journals. So like I have an article coming out in October's school library journal, actually on escape rooms. Myself and my colleague are going to be talking about, and wrote an article about, you know, educational escape rooms and kind of tips and best practices and some of the things that we've done as well too. Yeah.
And then, do you also do you offer other services? Do you consult with other librarians, schools, teachers? Or are you so busy you can't even think about that? Is that 10 years down the road?
No. I do consulting and I do workshops. I travel around the country all the time, just kind of talking and sharing and doing workshops and presentations and hands-on things. They're all fun and engaging because they're games. So I do it on kind of using games in curriculum, doing game design, doing breakout stuff, and just kind of introducing and guiding people through stuff.
This is just, I think, the tip of the iceberg. We tried to squeeze in as much as we could in the time we had, but I think you could go on for hours. Thank you very much for spending the time with us, and I look forward to discovering a lot more and designing our first escape room as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun. Thanks, everybody.
Cool, Brian. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.